Austin Osman Spare, a name that has greatly affected not only the world of the occult, but the art world as well. He is seen as a founding father of chaos magic and surrealism, using the power and inspiration from the primal and atavistic currents within ourselves. Born December 31st, 1886, in the area of Snow Hill, London, to parents Philip Spare and Eliza Osman. Though later in life, he was uncertain as to whether he was actually born on the 31st or actually in the early hours of January 1st, 1887. As a child, Austin was already showing his passion for art. As his mother would say, he could draw all day with his pencils happily. And one of his sisters is quoted saying of Austin in his childhood, describing him just like a mischievous fairy. Soon, at the age of 13, he would begin taking classes at the Lambeth School of Art, his tutor being Philip Conard, and would often be visiting the Theosophical Library, likely being the origin of his lust for the mystic. Within the next year, Austin would begin interning as a designer at Powell's Glassworks, who would go on to suggest him to try for a scholarship at the Royal Arts College, which he proceeds to do and is accepted. During the latter half of Austin's teens, he would meet a Mrs. Patterson, who was Austin's second mother figure, and, as he is quoted saying, is a witch of the same lineage as those of Salem. Mrs. Patterson showed Austin her ways of the Sabbath, fortune-telling, and many other things, leaving a great impact on Austin's views and beliefs. Miss Patterson also possessed a limited vocabulary, primarily using slang when speaking. However, back to his time at the Royal Arts College, during which he made many friendships and would leave a great impression on those he met, such as artist Herbert Budd, who would describe Austin to Steffi Grant as a godlike figure of whom the other students stood in awe, a fair creature like a Greek god, curly-haired, proud, self-willed, practicing the black arts, taking drugs, disdainfully apart from the crowd. Activist and writer Sylvia Pankhurst, whom Austin greatly supported, would go on to talk on the effect Austin's art had on the other students, saying the weirdness of his work in those days caused first-year women students to see him as a dangerous person. During this time, Austin would be working on his little-known Book of the Kia, which, during an interview in May of 1904, at which he had papers between two wooden slabs, one having a painted-on elephant-headed figure with outreached human arms, who could possibly be Ganesha, and the other slab, a painted frowning Isis-like deity, possibly being Nut. On being questioned about the book, he is quoted saying, "It is the cover for the writings of a new religion I dreamed about." During the interview, he had more to say, saying, quote, "I go to church near here, but I don't believe in their doctrine. I have my own ideas of what we are, what we may become, and all my sketches are alive with this religion." The same month, Austin would go on to hold his first expo in the Newington Library, already beginning to show his beliefs in Zos and Kia. At an unknown time in 1904 or 5, he was staying in the home of Robert Hugh Benson, of which two stories emerge. First, on a cloudless summer day, Austin and Benson would go for a walk. During this walk, Benson would ask Austin if he could conjure up some rain. Austin would go on to draw a sigil on the back of an envelope he happened to have. Austin then focused on this sigil, and within 10 minutes, clouds began to concentrate above them, beginning to downpour, soaking the two of them. The next story involves a man Benson introduced to Austin, one Hon Fielding, the secretary of the Society of Psychic Research. To test Austin, Hahn asked him if he could materialize what Hans was visualizing. To do this, Austin drew the sigil of one of his familiar spirits. Soon, Austin received what Han was visualizing. After this, he drew a sigil for what he saw and told Han to stop visualizing what he saw while Austin concentrated on the sigil. A knock would come to the hotel room door, and when Han opened the door, a valet was waiting for him to offer Han a pair of slippers. At this time, Austin would also be writing Earth Inferno, a work inspired by Blavatsky and Omar Khayyam, with the idea of Earth already being a kind of hell and the survival of the soul past our physical selves. Here also, Austin mentions Kia and Zos, both having several meanings. Kia is man's will, shadow, and Ein Sof, the negative existence. Zos is man's potential and imagination. Zos is represented by the eye and vulva, while Kia is the hand and phallus. Austin describes the dweller on the threshold like this, quote, "As we dwell on the threshold to one extreme, the intrinsic being is prematurely nascent, creating a chaos of reflection. When we gaze into the mirror of ourself and see our works as others judge them, then we realize our insignificance to the incomprehensible intellect of absolute Kia, the omnipotent, and how subcutaneous our attainments are. Alas, we are children of the earth. This is the hell of intrinsic being." The following year, Austin's art would be featured in the St. Louis Art Expo and the Paris International Art Expo, at which he won a silver medal, being praised for his remarkable sense of color and great vigor of conception. However, he would leave the art college because he greatly disliked his time there, going on to become a bookplate illustrator, his first commission being from Ethel R. Wheeler, who commissioned Behind the Veil, and later he would go on to privately publish 275 copies of his Earth Inferno, also making his first political cartoon, being on Chinese slave labor being used in South Africa. The year is now 1906. Austin has begun signing his art with a sigil of his initials, though he stopped doing this 4 years later, deciding it should only be used for magical purposes. But back to 1906, as he also began his book of satyrs. Satyrs actually being used instead of satire, as it contains 9 satirical drawings being on the church, existence, which includes one of his early sigils, quackery, intemperaments, fashion, a magazine called The Connoisseur, politics, The Beauty Doc, and officialism. Soon, in 1907, Austin would join the Golden Dawn and would meet Aleister Crowley while visiting Cambridge, later in the year joining the Astrum Argentum on the 7th of July, taking the name Yehovium. Austin would go on to leave the Golden Dawn, and in October he would hold his first large expo called Black and White Drawings by Austin Osman Spare, being held in Burton Gallery. His art was commonly described as eccentric and grotesque. A reporter for The World would write, "His inventive faculty is stupendous, terrifying, in its creative flow of impossible horrors." And The Observer reported, "Mr. Spare's art is abnormal, unhealthy, wildly fantastic, and unintelligible." By 1909, Austin would visit Egypt, likely giving him great inspiration for his views on man's animalistic past and hybrid gods, and would go on to take the oath of probationer. 2 of Austin's automatic drawings would be featured in Aleister's A Handbook to Geomancy in the September issue of The Equinox. The following year, he would go on to illustrate The Starlit Mire, which includes one of Austin's most well-known pieces, being a fantasy. It was a woman with horned beasts, a small portrait of Austin, and a ram-headed hermaphrodite spouting out of her back, showing our connection in ourselves to our primal ancestry and the infinite Kia. In 1911, however, Austin would meet a woman who held a great surprise for him. He would call her Mrs. Shaw, and they met in a local pub. Mrs. Shaw had a daughter named Ellie, who was pregnant and wished to introduce Austin to her. After meeting, Austin would frequently draw portraits of Ellie, and soon the two were married. On September 4th, 1911, the marriage would go on to struggle as their personalities greatly clashed. Ellie was said to be materialistic and not what one would call an intellectual. She also greatly disliked Austin's friends and would go on to ask Austin to stop associating with them. They would go on staying separate and divorced in 1916 when Ellie was with another man. At this time, Austin would be writing his Book of Pleasures while living in Golders Green. In the Book of Pleasures is Austin's first public explanation of his beliefs, beginning with a few definitions such as God, religion, morals, and women are all just forms of belief, and belief in the traditional way of the world and its popular religions as vice, which fear, faith, science, and control are also. Austin sees pure art as an example of virtue, Kia as the absolute freedom, which being free is mighty enough to be reality and free at any time, therefore is not potential or manifest, except as its instant possibility by ideas of freedom or means, but by the ego being free to receive it, by being free of ideas about it, by not believing. The less said of it, the less obscure is it. Remember, evolution teaches by terrible punishments. That conception is ultimate reality, but not ultimate free from evolution. He described self-love as a mental state caused by laughter, allowing the ego appreciation. And finally, exhaustion, such as being greatly disappointed by a past desire, and in this state, one's subconscious is open to the suggestion of the sigil. Austin would also describe his neither state, saying, in heaven there is desire for women, hell the desire intense, purgatory is exception delayed, indifference but disappointment till recovery. The verily, they are one and the same. The wise pleasure seeker, having realized there are different degrees of desire, and never desirable, gives up virtue and vice, and becomes the keyest. Riding the shark of his desire, he crosses the ocean of the dual principle and engages in self-love. He goes on saying, religion acts as a veneer for our incapacities and insignificance. Austin believes when faith perishes, the self shall come into its own. Others less foolish obscure the memory that God is a conception of themselves, and as much subject to law. Then this ambition of faith, is it so very desirable? Myself, I have not yet seen a man who is not God already. As to prayer, it is of little use except as a means of exhaustion. Austin goes on to state his dislike of ceremonial magic, quote, saying, these magicians, whose insincerity is their safety, are but unemployed dandies of the brothels. Magic is but one's ability to attract without asking. Ceremony, what is unaffected, its doctrine the negation of theirs. Their methods depending on a morass of the imagination and a chaos of conditions, their knowledge obtained with less decency than the hyena his food. I say they are less free and do not obtain the satisfaction of the meanest among animals. Moving on, Austin regards our conscious reality, the physical world and time among other things, as purely an illusion of the law of duality, believing reality is truly beyond duality, and that there is no such thing as life and death, these being only beliefs. We are all reincarnated and are recycled, and perhaps one day you yourself will begin to see glimpses into your own past. Austin also refers to what he calls unlearning, or forgetting what one was taught, adopting anew with a fresh mind, saying, quote, Almighty is he who has not learnt, and mighty is the babe. It has the power of assimilating, unquote. The death posture has a significant role in Austin's magic. Some compare it to the state of pranayama, being a state of great discomfort and rigidity. Quote, saying, lying on one's back, the body expressing the emotion of yawning, stretching as much as one can. Here, you are beyond time, and breathing deeply yet spasmodically until exhaustion. Before attempting, one should practice gazing into a mirror until your reflection is blurred. Close your eyes and envision a light above you, doing this until the vision fades, giving you the feeling of immensity. Austin has also described this as Set decreeing his ascendancy over Horus, lord of the double horizon and all that lies between. Repeated use of the death posture. You begin to remember the continuum of consciousness, thus realizing the self already is death, transcending fear and becoming all desire, and desiring nothing, obtaining ecstasy to its own end. Quote, new sexuality, unquote. And more on the neither. It is the state of the in-between conceptions and going beyond or into the void, being, quote, true freedom and existence. Austin uses the hermaphrodite to represent the neither, as it is neither man nor woman. This is the abode of Kia, and is comparable to Ein Sof, or Da'at, and is the atmospheric I. He says that, quote, when the ego sees self-love, there is peace. It becomes the seer. Directly we desire. We have lost all. We are what we desire. Therefore we never obtain. Desire nothing, and there is nothing that you shall not realize. The idea of God is primordial sin. All religions are evil. Self-love is its own law, which may be broken with impunity, being the only energy that is not servile, serving its own ever-ready purpose. Surely it is all that is left us that has no sin and is free. There is no sin more sickening than love, for it is the very essence of covetousness and the mother of all sin. Hence, it has the most devotees. Self-love only is pure and without a congregation. To achieve self-love, one has to give up all his beliefs and external conceptions, leaving oneself within its own sphere and to its own means. Austin states that the energy to be used for the visualization of the sigils is, quote, disease and insanity, is caused when the disembodied energy has no vital function. It is this energy which is utilized for the vitalization of sigils. When a sigil is made, it should be repressed as well as one can, as, quote, when conscious of the sigil form at any time but the magical, it should be repressed or a deliberate striving to forget it. By this, it is active and dominates at the unconscious period. Its form nourishes and allows it to become attached to the subconscious and becomes organic. That accomplished is its reality and realization. He becomes his concept of greatness. Austin sees the subconscious as the storehouse of memories of all past life and experiences, from ancient man to plant life and animal life. He goes on to say that evolution is assisted by this subconscious desire, giving the example, quote, a bat first grew wings, and of the proper kind, by its desire being organic enough to reach the subconsciousness. If its desire to fly had been conscious, it would have had to wait till it could have done so by the same means as ourselves, i.e., by machinery. Austin uses the sentence, quote, this my wish to obtain the strength of a tiger, as an example on how to make a sigil, condensing it into 3 individual sigils. First, quote, this is my wish is made into. To obtain becomes, and the strength of a tiger. He goes on to further combine these into one sigil, giving 2 different examples, explaining, quote, Sigils are made by combining the letters of the alphabet simplified, the idea being to obtain a simple form which can be easily visualized at will and has not too much pictorial relation to the desire. After conceiving a sigil, one should exhaust themselves by whatever preferred means, such as exercise, orgasm, walking, mantra, or other pleasures. Once exhausted, visualizing the sigil, that shall fade into the subconscious. Achieving, quote, by sigils, depending upon the intensity of desire, is illuminated or obsessed from that particular karma relative to the desire, but not from memory or experience which was recent, uniting the desire and karma. In the following year, Austin would leave the Astrum Argentum, as on December 30th, 1912, Alistair would be assessing the AA's members, noting on Austin's form, quote, an artist can't understand organization or would have passed, unquote. Also disliking Austin's use of incubi, considering Austin using black magic. Fast forward 2 years, and Austin becomes involved with the art publication, Color, containing a strange mix of poetry, short stories, and articles on art. However, this would inspire Austin to create his own magazine, Form, with the idea supported by publisher John Lane. Form's first issue would come in April of 1916, including contributions by Edmund J. Sullivan, Walter de la Mare, Frank Brangwyn, W.H. Davies, and J.C. Squire. The magazine would be poorly received, with critic George B. Shaw stating it was a, quote, very horrible publication and out of date. However, in its first volume, Austin co-wrote with Frederick Carter an article on automatic writing. Austin goes on to explain that automatism is a great source of individuality and a greater tool for the artist that is inhibited by society's beliefs and standards. This could also make one who is not an artist become one. He would state, quote, the ecstatic condition of revelation from the subconscious. The mind elevates the sexual or inherited powers and depresses the intellectual qualities. So a new atavistic responsibility is attained by daring to believe, too possesses one's own beliefs without attempting to rationalize spurious ideas from prejudice and tainted intellectual sources. A method for this is essentially the same as that of a sigil, but for your desired outcome, and once exhausted, you allow your hand to freely and subconsciously move, slowly building a form, line upon line, shape upon shape. I would also like to quote an article from the 10th issue of Abrahadabra, quote, automatism as being the manifestation of latent desires, the meaning of the forms obtained represent the previously undetermined obsessions and does not become experience through this illuminism or ecstatic force, a functional activity that expresses through symbolic language the immediate desire for pleasure, the meaning of the mother of all things. In February of the same year, Austin was staying in a cottage with poet Ezra Pound and would enlist in the military as a medical orderly, but would later be promoted to staff sergeant and tasked with illustrating the war from a studio on 76 Fulham Road, consisting of 20 studios being referred to as the Avenue, producing hundreds of portraits. This would also be the beginning of Austin's, quote, the inferno of the normal, later going on to say, there were 20 years where absolutely nothing happened to me. In 1921, Austin's The Focus of Life would be published, in which he expands on his views of love and death, as well as laying the basis for what is later referred to as Saskia Cultus by Kenneth Grant. Austin declares a new sexuality, saying, man is something that has resurrected from an archetype, a previous desire gone to worms. All conceptions predetermine their degeneration or are superseded by degrees of morality. Verily, a new sexuality shall be mine, unnecessary to degenerate or surpass. To give it a name, I shall call it unmodified sexuality. Without a name, it shall be conscious of all desire, Thus no ecstasy shall escape me. Its wisdom shall be dreams of self-love, vibrating all manifestation. I am he who self-pleasures non-morally. Austin then goes on to describe death as the great chance and the experience of death as all shall experience the rushing winds that blow from within, the body beyond perspective into cosmic dust, till consciousness again develops. Death is a transfiguration of life, an inversion, a reversion of consciousness to parentage, and maybe a diversion, a continuation of evolution, the coming forth of the suppressed. As to what would be the basis to Saskia Cultus, Austin writes that its sacred book is the book of pleasure, its path as the eclectic between ecstasies, the precarious funambulatory way, its deity as the all-prevailing woman, similar to the scarlet woman, its creed, Zos, the living flesh, its sacrament, the sacred in-between concepts, its word does not matter, need not be, its eternal abode, the mystic state of neither, the atmospheric eye, Kia, and finally, its law is to trespass all laws. Zos is further related to the hand and sentiency, as well as Set and Horus, as Kia with the eye, vision, and the goddess. The atmospheric eye is related further with cosmic energy, orgon, and the libido. To end the focus of life, I will touch on what the language of truth, as Austin says, the true wisdom cannot be expressed by articulate sounds. The language of fools is words. In the labyrinth of the alphabet, the truth is hidden, one thing repeated many times, with the true language of truth being silence. Another year goes by, and Austin would create the art journal, The Golden Hind. It would be co-edited by Clifford Bax. The journal would go on to have 8 issues, the final being in 1924, including Austin's lithograph, The New Eden. The same year, being 1924, Austin would make The Book of Ugly Ecstasy, which was a book of automatic drawings, with the original being sold to collector Gerald Reiflinger, who said he would part with any of his other pieces before he would the book. Austin would also begin to work on his Anathema of Zos and illustrating poems for Victor Nuremberg, but these would never see the light of day. In 1926, Austin would meet Hannon Swafer, journalist, critic, and spiritualist. The following year, he would hold an exposition at St. George's Gallery, and the Anathema of Zos would be published, aka the Sermon of Hypocrites. The Anathema goes on to emphasize the importance of leaving behind the world's beliefs, and to truly set your belief into the self, straying from the herd. Austin goes on to say, quote, "Honest with Saddam, your theology is a slime pit of gibberish become ethics. In your world where ignorance and deceit constitute felicity, everything ends miserably, besmirched in fratricidal blood, as well as go labor, fulfill the disgust of burying yourself, of discovering your beliefs, thus acquire virtue, let your God be accidental, thus escape gratitude, and with it sorry vainglory. For the wrath of heaven is heavy on self-indulgence." He explains that the subconsciousness is the epitome of all existence and wisdom, past incarnations as men, animals, birds, vegetable life, etc. Everything that has and ever will exist, each being a stratum in the order of evolution. Naturally then, the lower we probe into these strata, the earlier will be the forms of life we arrive at. The last is the almighty simplicity. And how the energy from disappointment can be used to give power for magical means, saying, quote, "When fundamental disappointment is experienced, the symbol enshrining a quota of belief is destroyed. In some cases, the individual is unable to survive the disappointment. But if at such times the moment is seized upon and consciously experienced for its own sake, the vacuum attracts into itself the entire content of belief inherent in the person at the time of disappointment." 2 years pass, and Austin will hold an expo at Lefebvre Gallery and another at the following year at Godfrey Phillips Gallery, entitled Experiments in Relativity, consisting of portraits of local women and film stars. This would be Austin's last expo in the West End for 17 years, and by 1932, reporter Hubert Nicholson would run an article calling Austin the father of surrealism. He's a Cockney. However, Austin is quoted jokingly saying to Hannon Swafer he was contemplating the gas oven, as this was a struggling time for Austin. On the 26th of November, he would be interviewed by A.W. Austin for Psychic News, explaining a panel he painted of Egyptian deities, intending on aiding him with communing with the ancient knowledge of Egypt that is imprinted on the astral plane, saying, quote, "Several requests I have made to the great race of Egyptians, and all have been answered. I do not merely request and leave it at that. When I ask for a thing, which I do by placing a note in front of the panel, I deliberately make some sacrifice. I give up smoking, which is a great hardship, or something like that, until the request has been granted. Doing this by the starving of a lesser desire, i.e., smoking." Once, Austin had 2 guests who insisted that he conjure an elemental. Austin, giving in to their pressuring, did so, and after some time of nothing happening, the room would begin to fill with green tendril-like vapor. The tendrils of vapor would begin to make shape and moved their way, becoming more and more solid. It brought with it a nauseating stench and atmosphere. Its eyes were like blazing pits of oil. It began to dominate the space, and Austin's guests, afraid, asked him to make it go away. Accordingly, he banished the elemental, which began to shrivel and disintegrated. According to Austin, within 1 week, one of the guests died of no apparent reason, and the other interred into an asylum. In 1936, 37, and 38, Austin would hold expos at Walworth Road, focusing on surrealism, and inspired to use pastel by Ada Millicent Payne, who had gifted Austin a set of pastels. On May 10th, 1941, Austin's studio would be hit in the Blitzkrieg, Austin calling this Hitler's revenge for denying to do his portrait in 1936. This would leave one of Austin's arms paralyzed, but this would not stop him, and in 1948, Austin would do a self-portrait of himself as Hitler. Once, while visiting Austin before this, Vera Wainwright would note that his studio's roof and floor had a hole from an unexploded bomb that was now in the basement. The other residents of the building would leave because of this. After this, Austin, having no reliable place to live, would be taken in by Ada into her Brixton home, and he would create the sketchbook of landscapes, standing stones, anthropomorphic plants, and human figures titled Drawn While Spotting for Bombs between 1944 and 45. In November of 1947, Austin would hold a large expo at Archer's Gallery, being 200 new studies in psychophysiognomy, having a mix of portraits such as Arthur Conan Doyle, Kate Fox Jenkins, as well as a mix of spivs, ghosts, hobos, layabouts, fiddlers, and more. This would be engineered by journalist Dennis Bardens. Almost all the pieces would be sold, and Austin would soon be considered Britain's first pop artist. After this, Steffi Grant, a fan of his work, would seek Austin out. Upon their first meeting, Steffi would be surprised by Austin's appearance, describing him as, quote, old, bent, and decrepit-looking, dressed in tattered clothes which he perhaps slept in. He was unkempt, his hands trembled, but he was welcoming and easy. During this visit, Steffi would buy from Austin an elongated head, a portrait of one of Austin's spirit guides, as well as a Mexican mask. These would be a birthday present for her husband, Kenneth Grant. This would be the beginning of a great friendship and the exchanging of many, many letters. Austin is quoted saying to Hannon Swafer in 1950, quote, "As for a glimmering of occult knowledge, I have always had it in me from childhood. It developed most just before the war, 1914, and afterwards. The ability to read the cards first came to me when I was a boy through an old lady. She lived to be 101, a friend of my parents. She used to tell my fortune when I was quite young. She impressed me as a person. Even when she died, she seemed no older than when we first met. She was a natural hypnotist. She would say, 'Look in that dark corner,' and if you obeyed, she could make you visualize what she was telling you, your future." During the months of November and December, Austin would begin hanging paintings in his basement apartment, preparing for an open house, allowing critics to come and view or purchase pieces, and would have local models, typically between the age range of 70 to 93 years old. At this time, he would also do some teaching from his apartment, calling it Austin Spare School of Draftsmanship, doing this from January to June. In 1949, Austin and the Grants would become much closer, visiting many pubs together as well as slum walking. Three of Austin's favorite pubs being the George, Cafe Royale, and the Old White Goat. Kenneth would note in his diary, quote, "He took titbits wrapped in newspaper to feed swarms of marauding cats, and would tell to, quote, not touch them as they had savaged someone's hand." Kenneth would encourage Austin to continue work on his magic texts. In their letters, Austin would begin signing and referring to himself as Zos. He would also be quoted saying, in his opinion, the Book of the Dead was the best book. By 1952, Austin and Kenneth would collaborate on The Witch's Sabbath, while Austin also worked on the Logomachy of Zos, reportedly with the aids of hundreds of oracles, one being the Delphic Pythoness, whom Kenneth suspected could have been the spirit of Miss Patterson, whom Austin claims gave him knowledge of aesthetics and philosophy, also inheriting the familiar of a black eagle from Mrs. Patterson. In A Witch's Sabbath, Austin also goes on to describe what goes into the Sabbath, beginning with the argument, "All magic takes on its own color. There is neither black nor white Sabbath. The ethical criterion of all acts is whether they are antisocial or evil motivates," and describes the Sabbath as a, quote, "inverse reversion for self-seduction and undoing for a divertive connotation. Sex is used as the medium and the technique of a magical act," unquote. "Your whole training is submissive and obedient until he can transmute, control, and divert him or herself where desired by transference and cold amoral passion. The Witch of the Sabbath is usually old and grotesque, breaking aesthetic norms being the sexual vehicle. This makes one amoral and focused, freeing your life force of inhibitors, transferring reality into a state of, quote, artistic wishful thinking." Austin explaining, quote, "The personal aesthetic culture has the value and has destroyed more effective affinity than any other belief. But he who transmutes the traditionally ugly into another aesthetic value has new pleasures beyond fear." Next, the Logomachy of Zos, or the Book of Zos vel Thanatos, Thanatos being Austin's god form. This would be a kind of book of statements, such as wisdom is eternal and forever recycled, and that no matter how much someone believes they know, they can always learn, as does the fool. And that we are all part of a larger ego, and that man's distinction from the animal is our sense of the personal. Also going on to say that art is a gift, a universal tongue, and a fundamental path to wisdom. He believed that if our aspirations are unattainable, that our subconscious would reveal a way to succeed, as well as it being better to worship our zoomorphic past rather than an unknowable future. Austin is quoted saying, quote, "Let us desire no better pantheon than the zoomorphic, in which to find a place. Better to venerate our animal ancestry until fully human than the least attainable and most unknowable. Will disclose our next step." Austin also emphasizes the importance of fiction as it being just as important of what we call, quote, reality, questioning what we could really know in our world of chaos and made-up meanings, stating one of the truest experiences in our reality is sexuality, and labeling pure ego as the informing agent, the empirical ego as conative, and the consciousness as the emotional value. Quote, knowledge is one thing through another. He also says, we are dimensionally caged, but imagination gives us fewer bars to peer through. And that the secret to happiness is harmonizing with yourself, loving all and vitality of form, seeing boredom as a disease, and ourselves being formed by our doubts, hopes, and fears, being, quote, cramped into a corner by whatever God you pray to, calling God, quote, intent to pray. By 1954, Austin's health would be failing, and he would nearly die of anemia, writing, quote, 31st May, I thought my last moments were here when I refused transfusion. My doctor gave me 3 days to live. Anyways, I cured myself by will, medicine I know of, and diet. Now I can cure anyone also with anemia, I hope. I've certainly got over 2 doses by my own effort. Steffi would also write, quote, he had a very disconcerting habit of swallowing all sorts of medicines he swore by and which he administered to himself by himself. So to say, he thought of doctors as well-meaning but useless. She would also write, quote, he was mad on cats. They crawled all over his place too, cozy tame strays, wandering straight in and out of the kitchen, which was his back room, with a Colgate, more pictures in it, and which only gave on to a moldy little yard where nothing grew in the fetid soil. Austin preferred things to be stray and natural, saying, quote, I am not one for pets really, or even cut flowers. I like things growing in their place. Once having a large tank of water, growing large hardy plants in it, admiring their growth and subtle movements. During this time, he would make the pieces Witchery, The Walpurgis Vampire, and Satiated Succubi. Austin would also hold the first of as many art expos in local pubs, beginning at the Temple Bar, earning Austin 200 guineas and a commission from Michael Hall to illustrate the 5th issue of the London Mystery Magazine that would also contain an article on Austin by Hannon Swafer. Kenneth would send Austin a letter admitting, quote, I can't always disentangle my own fantasies from what you're actually saying, i.e., I tend to read into your books too much my own experience, thus probably missing the vital point of the whole thing. And if you have time, would you please jot down a few private notes for my benefit? Austin would reply, quote, I'm mapping out a really good thing on magic in general, which we can both work on. You an intro to magic generally, and I a specific formula. I'll give you my portion first, but you will be quite safe working without me, as yours will corner magic in a general way. The formula would go on to be in the Zoetic Grimoire of Zeus, containing the White Sabbath and multiple formulas. The Sabbath has the same basis as before, using different forms of sex, incense, drugs, wine, and mantra. Its credo being, quote, Fornicatus benedictus, almighty Asmodeus, existent of chaos, ominous by name. Thy kingdom come through me to earth, lead me into all temptations of my flesh, so I might trespass greatly into thy ways by my desires, for thou art all sex-seeking unity, thou mighty genitalia of creation, that knoweth no satiation. Grant thou my wish, for thou art all power, ecstasy, and actuality. Amen. Its affirmation is that of the in-between, the neither, and Kia, also stating, quote, we, who are about to partake of each other, shall walk past all amorous sickness and deaths, for we are within the magical equinox. Amen. We, who proudly make unto ourselves every graven image, shall have great copulations, and are allowed to love our gods, for we know the sacred alignments. Amen. We, who do not crucify, nothing shall hurt us, that is, of the nature, neither our comings and goings from the womb, for we have the key to all aesthetics, amen, and ending with this, quote, thou insatiable peripheral quadriga of sex, amen. Next is the prayer calling out the emissary of the neither, the, quote, silent watcher, represented by the vulture in much of Austin's art. Finally, an evocation to the watcher. O mighty Recta, thou who exist in all egregiousness, we evoke thee. By the power of the meanings arising from these forms I make, we evoke thee. By the talismans that speak this secret leitmotif of desire, we evoke thee. By the sacrifices, abstinences, and transvaluations we make, we evoke thee. By the sacred in-between concepts, give us the flesh. We who shall suffer all ecstasies, give us invariant desire. by the conquest of fatigue, give us eternal resurgence. By the most sacred word graph, we invoke thee. Amen. Recta is obviously watcher reversed. This is meant to obscure and meant to aid in reaching backwards into more obscure times. The first of the formulas, though, come from the genie of the brazen vessel, called, quote, giving life to the autistic by virgin earthenware. To do this, one needs to fashion a vase that creates a vacuum around your lingam when erect. Once done, it should be used to pleasure yourself until orgasm, at which you should visualize your desire and state your wish. After, one must seal the vase with your desired sigil and method, and burying it at midnight. Once you reach a quarter full moon, dig the vessel back up and pour out its contents, to then rebury the vase. Austin says this formula is very effective. He also mentions the consumption of one's own nectar or semen, saying, quote, now let him imagine a union takes place between himself and the nectar, the mystical union of the ego and the absolute. The nectar emitted, let him slowly drink again and again. Saying this is the syllabub of the sun and moon, and that it is an astonishing experience of passion. The next formula I'll cover is that of, quote, communion of auto-ego, based on Apollonius. Its conditions should be in solitude, silence, and in secret. You should create your own secret alphabet, and once committed to memory, burn it, never writing it out again. It will become your psychic or soul's language. With this, your desire should be perfectly known and altruistic, and you shall only receive what you are fit to receive. The final formula I will cover is that of returning evil to its source. You must build up a hate for this evil, formulating it and focusing the hate to become incarnate, to which an elemental shall pierce the offending aura, and this requires a belonging of the offender, an animal familiar, and a perfect idea of the desired consequence. Before ending this story, I will touch on 3 more of Austin's works and some of his opinions, starting with a quote from his The Living Word of Zos. Quote, to be near to God, we must regress functionally and rely most on atavistic impulse from the remotest strata of our being until we are motivated by pure instinctism, needing no other reaction than his own spontaneity. And, quote, I predict that our next society will be a wise synthesis based on a cooperative individualism. Austin is also quoted saying, darken your room, shut your door, and empty your mind. Yet you are still in great company. The Newman and your genius, with all their media, and your host of elementals, and ghosts of your dead loves are there. They need no light by which to see, no words to speak, no motive to enact, except through your own purely formed desire. And Gavin Semple of Vulgar Press calls these dwellers at the gates of silent memory our nascent selves. I will now touch on Austin's modus operandi, in which he states, quote, through the sigil, the elemental shall manifest according to the elemental's nature and the sorcerer's most acceptable perception, gaining autonomy through the ego, thus becoming a familiar. You will recognize the elemental through omen or coincidence. The sigil can also be used to control an obsession, specifically love. The power of the sigil is its use to align your desire with the universal will, quote, aligning and identifying. Austin is also quoted saying, verily he stills the fire from heaven, the greatest act of bravery in the world. The past, present, and future endlessly reflect each other in the double mirror of I being conceptless and ever free. He goes on to further explain that Zos is, quote, the only thing that is and the only thing that will cease to be. O Zos, that shall live in a million forms, and every conceivable thing happen unto thee. And that Zos is the immortal adept, and Kia the sorcerer, giving the example of Taliesin, Kadir, Merlin, and Lao Tzu. In Micrologos, Austin says, quote, psychology is now the equal of any other dogma, inasmuch as it demands the full acceptance of rigid conclusions from undefined qualities and premises. He states, quote, it presents a worse gamble than that of any other religion. Psychism has no standard of morality, behaviorism, or normality, with which it mainly deals, so must be based on the common mean, the average, and inelastic average at that. He also calls Freud and Jung fraud and junk, and, quote, thus anything abnormal, subnormal, could or might be patho shit. Austin also believes that the universe and ourselves are never complete or completing, but a set base of revolving, resurging existing forms, quote, reshaping to function new pleasure, and that, quote, the division of self from self was a diversity for variety, and soon all animation becomes presence, neotic and numerous. Therefore, it is better to speak of the gods than a singular. And finally, quote, one damn thing after another, life and death, is an entering and leaving of different dream worlds, and reality is where we find or make it. Austin gives good warning in the quote, the threshold of the occult is the marketplace for the charlatan. The alphabet of desire, seen throughout much of Austin's work, is made by creating sigils or symbols representing different concepts, emotions, and experiences and used for magical purposes. Austin sees nature as a great teacher and felt a great connection to plants and trees. Austin stating, quote, trees can affect me more than humans, but it's purely psychic, and, quote, whether within or without, nothing is fully explicit. Nature reveals slowly her techniques and media. Of her motives, we know nothing. We only guess at them for our own wishes. Finally, I will go over Austin's techniques of divination and fortune-telling. First, another method of sigil specifically for periodic desires is choose 3 desires, make a sigil, and put the sigil on a card for each desire or on a small piece of paper. Set these aside somewhere where you won't see it for several days, trying to forget them the best you can. And when done, ideally, you would have forgotten which sigil means what, thus giving them more power, the key being forgetfulness. Also, he claims most fail at divination from a lack of knowledge of the symbols and chosen divination method. Austin had also made a deck of cards to go with his alphabet of desire, calling it the Arena of Anon. Now I will teach you how to tell fortunes using an ordinary pack of cards, each being an individual indicator, most being commonplaces, emotions, and abstract ideas. People are represented by the kings and queens, children by the knaves. Spades represent sickness, death, mourning, fear, and hate. Hearts, love, marriage, happiness, friendship, and generosity. Diamonds represent money, success, fame, and honor. Clubs, business, officialism, law, power, and knowledge. One special card should be an intensifier, and leftover cards should have meanings of your choosing. Once familiar with this, one should begin to develop cards of your own design and symbolism, ideally taking 6 months of development. Austin had 2 patterns of laying out the cards. First, laying the cards down in a line, left to right, beginning your reading at the left. The second, the cards are laid out in 4 lines of 13. Before laying out, you shuffle the cards whilst looking in the eyes of the readee, then they themselves shuffle the cards. Austin says, quote, once I was telling a friend's fortune and could see that he would die within a few months. Naturally, I did not tell him so. But what I did advise he was to at once put his affairs in order, and that in a few months there would be a great change in his affairs, of which not much could be said. Meantime, there was great happiness for him. He was to guard against accident. He was happy for the few months that he lived. I believe that forecasting is best used as I have used it, to gain wisdom and insight, and not for monetary gain, and that by such experiments prove the possibilities of spiritual powers for a more humane world. This story ends May 15th, 1956. Austin would be admitted into the London Southwest Hospital. His nurse would go on to tell Kenneth Austin's insides were in very bad condition. He would be diagnosed with a burst appendix, anemia, bronchitis, high blood pressure, and gallstones. Austin remains now in the cemetery of St. Mary's Church in Ilford. Later in the evening of the 15th, the Evening News would have this to say on Austin's passing, quote, a strange and gentle genius died in London Hospital this afternoon. You have probably never heard of Austin Osman Spare, but his should have been a famous name. I would like to end this video in Austin's own words. But first, don't forget to like and subscribe, and leave any topics you would like me to cover in the comments below. Now, Austin's own, quote, autobiographic for most genius. Speak to me not of quietism or tranquility, rather speak to the condemned of the safety of the gallows drop. My mother told me she suffered hell carrying me from birth. I have lived in chaos as of normality. Everything around me like nagging termagants, and all my affairs with women a miserable misalliance. Half my life a struggle for pence, the other half I live in sleeplessness. So when I have a few shillings, I loaf a while by intoxications. Strangely, I am not a drunk, saddened, or frustrated. Have few fears, great friendships, and believe deeply in soul. I am always stoic and have the power at times to forget the whole bloody civilization and also to smile at this misnomer and myself. I love all animals, the natural admiration of a noble ancestry. Other love is usually soaked in desire, always unstable or vicarious. Like many others, my desire is usually wisdom to express my ability in some way, to serve the young and helpless, to see and appreciate beauty, to have the warmth of friendship and sound sleep not yet. For me, there is no way but my way. Before that, you go your way. No one will lead you to walk to yourselves. Let your pleasures be like sunsets, sincere, bloody, great.